Well, hey, thanks for showing up to this session. My name is Tim. I'm the founder and creator behind the new Evangelicals. I'm the podcast host of the podcast that we have, and also I co-host a show with my friend April Ajoy called the Tim and April Show. It's been a lot of fun and quite the journey. This is my fourth beer camp, so it's been really cool to kind of show up and meet a lot of the same people. It's been really a privilege to meet amazing folks who are shaping so much of how I think about my own journey of leaving evangelical fundamentalism, kind of growing up in that world, homeschooled, John MacArthur, shaped by that version of Calvinism, and then as a drummer in the church, finding the charismatic side because they had the cooler music, and then eventually kind of leaving that just because I was like, I don't know, this Trump thing is really, call me a heretic, but the people who shaped me in Sunday school told me that I should never be anyone like Trump, and now if I don't vote for him, I'm going to be called a heretic. It didn't make any sense. So it's been a really cool journey, learning so much, and I'm really honored to have Dr. Reggie Williams with us. I mean, I told you this before, it truly is a dream interview. I've been following your work for a while, and we've been able to talk behind the scenes, so I really appreciate you making time and joining me on the main stage. Last minute, by the way, because I told Tripp a while ago, I said, I would love for Reggie to join me. And then today I'm like, hey, does Reggie know he's coming on the pod? And Tripp's like, I don't know, you gotta talk to him. I'm like, all right, I gotta talk to him. So it worked out. So thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I actually saw on the schedule last night.
Yeah, I figured. It's beer camp. There's a certain charm to it, like, where am I going? Okay, yeah. Well, I guess I want to get started for a little bit, and if we can have some time at the end and maybe take a few questions, that could be fun. I like interaction because usually I'm talking to a blank wall and a microphone, so it's rare that we get to do this in person together. But I want to start off, I know you do a lot of amazing work on Bonhoeffer. You had an amazing session earlier on that, so I'm sure we'll talk about that as we get started. But the main crux of my question to start us off with is, I think about Christianity as like a house, and I grew up in the basement of that house, and I've been able to peek my eyes into the room of Black Liberation Theology, just a little bit. And I've been really enthralled and drawn to what it might have to offer us given where we are today. Because it seems like there's a long legacy there.
Liberation?
Yeah, Black Liberation Theology, yeah. So I'm just kind of curious, like, your broad thoughts on like how you think about just that movement, especially in American history, that's kind of always been there as the response to white nationalism and white supremacy, and how you think about it moving today in 2025 America.
Sure. Good question. So liberation theology hits the academy really in the 60s. James Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power, comes out, and then Gustavo Gutierrez's book comes out, and you have others in Latin America that are publishing liberation theology. But the crux of the message of liberation theology, as Cone was developing it, came from his effort to make sense of his theological training at home. So he goes to Garrett Evangelical Seminary, and he writes a dissertation on Karl Barth's anthropology. He goes back, as he'll tell you in his book, his final book, said I wasn't going to tell nobody. He gives us the story of him trying to make sense of that theology from his seminary training back at home. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense back at home. It's not speaking from that location, from that experience. And then the Black Power movement hits. He sits down and he puts together thoughts on theology that take the Black Power movement as their main source as the main source of thinking theologically. Is there anything theological in this movement for black rights? This is the birth of, many people argue that this is in fact the birth of liberation theology, because this is the first book of liberation theology. And it's speaking in the language of context. We are all doing our theology from a context. There is no theology from nowhere in particular, one. Two, it is It's speaking in the language of God's preferential option for the poor, and in this case, the oppressed as well. That's secondly. 3, it's emphasizing praxis. Praxis meaning, some will argue that we all come to what we know with some background knowledge of something, on one hand. Secondly, that knowledge is gained in the act of performance. So it's speaking in the language of praxis. 4, actually. Sin is not simply individual. Sin is structural and systemic. What do we mean by systemic and structural? So systemic, you might say the family is a system. Church is a system. These things in society are systems. And then structure is how these things move together, how they work together. So sin is structural in society, not just individually and personal. So taking these several, and there's more that can be said about liberation theology, but taking these things in mind, the trajectory begins with making sense of a lived experience of a particular demographic of people in a society that is structured over and against their well-being, or actually situates them as minorities, less important, second-class citizens, partially human. To be thinking in that way. When we think about liberation theology or black theology as the location for this, and recognizing that all theology is done in context, then one can ask the question, what about this theology in the seminary?
Right.
In seminary, white theology. How does this speak as we think through the experience of black people in the classroom?
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's interesting hearing you explain it like that, because in my context, especially around the idea of like systemic, right? Something means systemically evil or sinful. It's a weird paradox, because on one hand, I was taught that I was inherently wicked and depraved, and that sin permeates everything. At the same time, I was told that systemic racism doesn't exist anymore. Right? And so you have this weird thing where like you're trained to be like, well, of course sin is everywhere. Of course it's systemic. But what this person or this particular set of people or this political side is talking about when it comes to these social issues, well, that doesn't really, this is embarrassing to say, but it's true. I was literally taught that MLK solved racism in the 60s. That was my tradition. But at the same time, sin is everywhere. I'm wicked and depraved. I'm evil. And it's a very interesting paradox hearing you talk about this, because I would say that makes complete sense, even as a conservative evangelical. But once you say the word racism instead of sin, oh, well, I'm not sure about that.
Sure.
So it's interesting to kind of see how these two things, like, there's a similarity, but also how they diverge along these lines, that of whiteness and, systemic racism.
I mean, just the awareness of that is insightful, it's brilliant and insightful. Because one of the things that the theology me learned, I was actually deeply influenced initially in my earlier years by an evangelical world as well.
Okay.
So I know what you're talking about.
Okay.
And you look at my CV, it says Westmont College on it. Westmont, and then 2 degrees from Fuller Seminary as well. So, I mean, these are evangelical spaces.
Totally.
So the theology doesn't have a reference for what we should be doing in society.
Yes.
That social issues are not matters of theological concern, but which points to our interpretation of what the gospel's about.
Exactly.
What is the gospel about? The gospel is about your personal salvation.
That's right.
Your individual relationship with Jesus, not about the way society is shaped in its treatment of your neighbors. We think about sin then as interpersonal type problems. In that case, then racism is not a structural thing, it's your feelings towards somebody who is of a different race than you.
It's a heart issue.
It's a heart issue. It's a matter of affect. And that when you become a Christian, then when you're repentant, your sin or your racism should be gone. And we stop talking about it then. Color blindness is the response to racism. Right.
Yeah.
It's about affect and your ability not to see sin, which just gives, it makes it so that we simply do not talk about what is right in front of us and how society is shaped. We don't talk about it. We don't mention it. You all become, and when you become Christian, you become complicit.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. And then I think about how there is, especially I think about the moral majority and what Jerry Falwell did, there is a certain social issue phenomena around abortion and LGBTQ plus inclusion that becomes this culture war that is justified somehow from the Bible. So it's just interesting because, again, I grew up in a space that was like colorblindness is the answer, right? Which ironically comes out of white supremacy, right?
Sure.
It's how they shift. Well, okay, we can't be openly racist. We'll just say the status quo, as things are.
Sure.
You know that kind of idea, right? So that's in my psyche as a kid. Like, hey, of course we don't see color, but also systemic racism doesn't exist, but also abortion is a systemic issue that must be legislated, right? So it's just very fascinating watching what is getting picked up and chosen to be applied societally versus individually, right? Racism is a hard issue.
Right.
Greed is a hard issue.
Sure.
But LGBTQ plus people having the access to the same marital rights that we have, that's a systemic issue.
Yeah, that's the devil.
That's the devil.
Yeah.
Right? And
right,
so
right.
it's that's the paradox I found myself wrestling with is it's inherently contradictory, and also I would argue that theology is so flimsy, which leads me to my claim that I wrestle between what drives what. Does the theology drive Christian nationalism or the politics? I go back and forth. I think ultimately the politics are in the driver's seat, but the theology is the justification they use to validate the God claim. But I don't know if you would agree with me on that. I would love to hear your thoughts on it, because I wrestle between the two.
Well, the theology really is one of the foundations of a myth. I would use the word myth here.
Okay.
There are scholars who talk about myth. One who I've been reading he was prominent in a chapter that I just finished. Cedric Robinson. If you know the name Cedric Robinson, you will know the book called Black Marxism. And Black Marxism is just the origins of the Black Marxism is just the origins of the Black radical tradition. It's not actually. Now that I say Marxism, let me explain what he's saying. Okay, well, he's saying that the narrative we know in the West about Marxist-Leninism is really European history. That doesn't include the stories. It's not about Africans. That when Africans come over, kidnapped and ambushed as they were, they enter a story of conflict. But they come over not wanting to be included. They want the eradication of this. They'd like to have their world. So this book about Black Marxism is about the origins of the Black radical tradition, which is not about inclusion, but recognizing a whole otherwise notion of being and of humanity and so forth. Okay, so that's what that is. His first book, Terms of Order, is about political theory. And in that book, he makes mention of the charismatic figure, of the charismatic moment. He's borrowing from Max Weber and his notion of charisma as a means for garnering political obedience, or obedience of a demographic. How do people obey their government? It's not just about laws and rules and so forth. Charisma is a huge part of this. Now, this is well before Trump. But the charismatic figure is a Christ-like figure, is what he's saying. So I'll leave that there. But as he's building this notion of the charismatic figure, he mentions myth. Myth as a unifying structure, a unifying mechanism for garnering obedience. What is myth? It's not, so the one way to describe myth is the pre-scientific origin story of a community, the origin story of a pre-scientific community. Okay, that's one way to describe it. But then there's the other one, he's borrowing from Foucault. Myth as the domain assumptions, the ideological scaffolding, the stuff that people believe that they don't know that they believe. I can say this here. When I'm in my classroom, I got to explain it. I can say this part here, that we've all been made to want Mayberry. And what is Mayberry? Who are the people of Mayberry? What is it about Mayberry that makes it so desirable? And we know you can describe Mayberry with adjectives. That's myth. Somebody just called it propaganda, but that's myth. That just sits in the background of our minds when we see the commercials for the political candidate that we want to vote for because they hang Mayberry in front of society. That's myth. Now, what are the things about this myth that is foundational is what I'm talking about when I talk about theology as foundational for harm in society and so forth, is that theology is a part of Mayberry. It props Mayberry up with sacred license. It gives you the notions of morality. It gives you the notion of good. And there's nothing wrong with that space. Of course, if this is what you're desiring, it is ultimately good. Why not fight for it? It's licensed to do harm and to kill even. Because the ultimate thing, you're fighting for what is moral. And the people who would hate Mayberry are obviously bad. They're obviously wrong. And I was going somewhere else before I went off on Mayberry.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I apologize for my ignorance, but can you explain Mayberry more? Because I'm a little lost. I mean, am I the only one?
I forgot how young this guy is.
I was a former homeschooler, to be clear, but I'm like, I'm rolling. I gotta ask. I have to be intellectually honest here.
Oh my gosh, Tim, I forget how young you are, man. Oh, jeez.
I'm on Instagram all day. Okay, I need help.
Yeah. Good Lord. I could have gone all day without remembering that I'm that much older than him. Somebody is whistling this. Yeah.
All right.
That's me.
Cool. That's Mayberry.
Yep. That's the tune for Mayberry right there. It's the Andy Griffith Show.
Okay.
You ever heard of that?
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it. Okay. In the for those of you who do not know, for the young folks in the crowd, I need to do it. This is good practice for me. So in the Andy Griffith Show, the show itself is set in a fictional town. It's actually a real town in North Carolina. Okay, it's set in a fictional town in a particular time period. And this town has a population that is monochromatic. Okay, it's all white. Okay, and this all white town, the majority of the story is set in this all white town in the police department. Andy Griffith is the town sheriff with his really goofy deputy, Barney Fife. And most of what they have to deal with in town are small character flaws within people from time to time, and they make the whole story around somebody's small character flaw. The only person who goes to jail in that town from time to time is a town drunk who checks himself in to jail.
Yeah.
But we know full Aunt B is an elderly woman who's the sheriff's aunt, and she makes these amazing apple pies. And they eat the apple pie and they joke, and Barney is just goofy, and this is basically the show. No trauma, no drama, no crime. It is a beautiful town. So much so that Rascal Flatts, if you know that group, they wrote a song called I Miss Mayberry, sitting on my porch drinking ice cold cherry Coke and everything was black and white.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. That was what I was painting in my head, but I didn't know the context for it. I mean, it echoes sentiments of the Make America Great Again slogan. I hear that kind of idea of we have to go back to this time.
No doubt.
Where, things were just so peaceful and so great. But of course the question is, well, for who? Right? We don't ask that question. Well, Lisa Sharon Harper, a good friend of mine, changed my life when she said, yeah, but who benefits from this decision being made? I'm like, I have never thought about that.
Yep.
Because I just assumed. I'm putting myself in that story.
Sure.
But that idea, that propaganda, right? Make America Great Again. We have to go back to a time when we had American values. They are intentionally broad So, and I think this is one of the methods of propaganda, right? They don't define terms intentionally, so their audience can fill whatever they want in their head with that thing. Like, what is this new appropriated term, wokeness? No one can tell you, and that's by design. So when someone says, oh, that's woke, the person puts their boogeyman caricature that's been shaped by media and propaganda in place of that. So I think about it with MAGA, Make America Great Again. Well, for who? They're not going to fill that in. Or if they do, it's very broad, and it always benefits the people who are on the white side of the black and white, dichotomy in that show, Mayberry or Andy Griffith.
Andy Griffith, yeah. Well, when you hear the fight against woke, also remember the fight against critical race theory.
Yep, totally.
You hear the fight against critical race theory, also remember the fight against Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. The fight against Black Lives Matter, remember the fight against the president, the Tea Party movement, yep, in opposition to the first black president. Remember the opposition to the first black president. Remember the fight against the civil rights movement that was pointed at by the slogan "Law and Order" that Nixon ran under. Right. When you remember the Law and Order slogan that was a rebuttal to the civil rights movement, recall that they had to fight to get a Voting Rights Act passed, a Civil Rights Act passed. And that came after, in 1877, the end of Reconstruction, which was a fight against integrating black people into the country as citizens. And before that, you had a whole civil war. So these moments of black progress are always met by rebuttal and fight, because for black people or minoritized people in this country to win something, the assumption is that white people will lose. They're losing something, and they're fighting for that thing that they're losing. There's no real logic behind a fight against woke. None whatsoever, as you've identified, except that it is an advancement, and that advance means something, that something's going to be lost. Why would you fight against the claim that Black Lives Matter? What makes sense about that? Right. Except that so my life doesn't matter now? Right. Who the hell said that? Nobody said your life doesn't matter.
Right. All lives matter, but now it's, well, throw the immigrants in cages. Right? It was all lives. That was a retort. Well, all lives matter. Well, now we're putting immigrants in concentration camps and disappearing them. So those lives don't really matter as much. So it's always there is always
just a rebuttal.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Always a rebuttal. And there's this well-funded right-wing media world that I get the pleasure of tracking all the time, who is always creating new narratives for their audience to believe, and always a new boogeyman that it's drawing from the same spirit. Right, like you kind of painted throughout history, but there's always a new way of saying it. So now it's DEI, right?
Sure.
Now it's, oh, that's a DEI hire, right?
Sure.
Oh, we need meritocracy, as Pete Hegseth is now in charge. Like, the math never maths, right? But the propaganda works. And I think that's what's so powerful about propaganda in particular, and how they're able to shape it, because as Matthew Taylor says, in Christian nationalism, truth is always subservient to power. Right, so will this give us more power and control? Yes, then do this. That's why people ask me a lot. I don't get it, Tim. Why did all of these Matt Walsh types, these commentators and people, why were they so against Colin Kaepernick kneeling during NFL games, but they were mad at the NFL for not holding a moment of silence for Charlie Kirk? Well, what gives them more power and control? Once you think about it through that framework, then it makes complete sense, right? Colin Kaepernick protesting, rightfully so, police brutality, racism, takes power and control away from that idea of whiteness and everything else. But Charlie Kirk being remembered at the NFL gives them more cultural power and control. And that's the best way I've been able to think about the logic of Christian nationalism and what we might call as white supremacy. But I'm curious if you think that's like a good foundational framework for the logic behind this, or there's something even deeper underneath of that.
It's the myth. It's the myth. You might think of it as the story they believe themselves to be living. We have competing stories within the country here. Yeah. And we are competing over the history, which is the story itself, and how this story is being told. Your story is under attack or at least if your story is being contradicted, what might you do? In the classroom, as Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas was just describing, in the classroom, you might be made uncomfortable when you come into school and you learn that what you've been told at home and what you live in your community might have a counter to it. And then you're trying to figure out what is real now for me, and I'm making sense of myself in the world as an emerging adult. And then I find another story that I inhabit. Discomfort is necessary for growth, right? Yeah. I learned as a teacher, anxiety shuts down learning and growth, but discomfort is like the fertilizer in the soil. You need it, right? What happens if I just refuse any and all discomfort and I just close my ears and only want this story alone? It has financial benefits, of course. It has financial. It has. It also has some of the impetus is just loyalty. Yeah. I noticed that when I'm in the classroom, not noticed, but when I'm in an intro to ethics classroom, when I'm talking about a controversial topic, say for example abortion, that this student here, even though they may come to recognize that that where they stand on this issue might not be so solid as they thought it was, yeah, for them to leave it behind is to betray grandma. Right. You know, or to betray the pastor, right, or so. So it's not as much logic as it is loyalties, you know? And those loyalties can be to grandma, could be to a paycheck.
Yeah. Were you, I'm not sure how much you did or didn't see of this, but were you surprised by the, I would argue, like broadly national response to Charlie Kirk being murdered, as far as just like the way that there was like a certain kind of martyrdom that they kind of painted onto him as being a good, I mean, some people who I follow in these spaces were like, he was preaching the gospel when he died. I'm like, no, he was actually being transphobic and talking about, you know, racist tropes about gang violence, but you think that he was this martyr. And then I saw some of his, you know, the funeral that they had. It was this huge spectacle, right? And I'm watching it, I'm like, wow. And again, I'm someone who comes from this world, I track this world, but even I was pretty surprised to see like some pretty mainstream like CCM worship leaders that really aren't political at all on like in like their presence publicly, leading worship at an event that shortly later our own president said, I hate my opponents. And Jack Posobiec, who is a person who's known to have white supremacist ties, he's actually the person behind the Pizzagate conspiracy a long time ago. This idea that there was a pizza shop in D.C. where Hillary Clinton and all these other Democrats were trafficking children, that caused a man to show up with a gun to shoot the locks off of a door in the building because he thought there was a basement down there, but there wasn't. Like, Jack Posobiec is that guy. He's on the Charlie Kirk show. He's at the funeral speaking publicly. And I'm like, oh my God, this is wild. And then there's like Brandon Lake and Carrie Joe, people that I used to drum to their songs back in my church. Never thought they would be tied to this. So I must admit, that did surprise me. But I'm curious for you, you know, looking at all of this, were you surprised at all by the response and like the veneration, almost like saint-like status? Or are you like, no, this is expected?
I guess maybe initially, but then it makes sense. When I talk about white Christian nationalism, the first time I spoke publicly about it, I removed the label Christian, not because I don't think it's Christian, but because it's implied in white. Because white is religious. White is a religion. Du Bois called it the religion of whiteness. And here I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about equality of any demographic of people, but I'm talking about a way of knowing the world. It's an epistemology. Some describe it even as onto-epistemology. But it's a way of about a way of knowing the world. And you know, epistemology is a study of knowledge acquisition and justified belief. How do we know what we know? How do we know the world? How do we know the world as human difference? How do we know what it means to be a human being? Whiteness gives us a response to that. And it is also, it has its sacred symbols to it. It has its sacred justification for it. We're talking about human being and white. This is a language, an idea out of Europe. Let me back up and say that human is not reference to a biological category, but an idea that needs an other to be legible to itself. It comes out of Europe and gives us a notion of who we are. It contrasts with animals, and it also contrasts with different types of people in different parts of the world. So that's how we give the red and yellow, black and white, and so forth. But those folks who Europeans met, had no idea that they were red or black or yellow. Right. They have notions of human in their land where they're from that don't reach the level of global discourse that the European one does, and is now defining human for the entire world. That idea is an argument for white ascendancy and white ownership. That's the first thing. And it comes with Christian justification. So Christ is the human for the world. And guess what? The human is European fully, and one of them as God's representative in the world. So this is the first place. It has Christian justification. It is a religion. Christian nationalism, so white nationalism is that. Dorothy Zerla called it Christofascism. So this is the reference that I would point to. And it has its sacred symbols. Jesus, white Jesus, the Bible-wrapped flag, the fetish, the gun fetish, all of these things. These are the sacred symbols of whiteness as religion.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, it's helpful. I mean, one of the things that I like to do on the podcast is I like having people come on who are just like, they're really, deeply have studied these things, are drawing from different sources to make the points. Because I think a lot of times folks who are kind of new to this world of like deconstruction, whatever we're going to call it, evangelicalism, they can think like, wow, no, Tim, like you're using some pretty extreme terms here, Christian fascism, like you sound kind of hyperbolic. And I'm like, look, I hear you. As someone who grew up on talk radio, I am like well attuned to like the Obama's destroying the country. I remember Glenn Beck crying on the radio. I'm a kid with my dad rolling walls, painting walls, and Glenn Beck is literally crying. I don't know if we're gonna have a country in 3 more years with Obama. So I'm aware of the level of exaggeration that can be said from people behind a microphone. But one of the reasons why I have shifted my language over the past maybe couple of years is because the more that I've been able to learn from folks like yourself and Jamar Tisby and Kristen Dumas, you go down the list, Anthea Butler, and the more I also experience these spaces by going to Turning Point USA's America Fest every single year and meeting people like Charlie Kirk and listening to their conversations and hearing what they're saying, the more, and then of course, all the other evidence that we now have under this new regime, the more I'm like, no, this is exactly what it is. And we have to tell the truth. If there's anything I learned from my evangelical background, it's that when the world tells you to move and compromise, you plant your feet and say, no, you move to me, right? So I look at my evangelical trajectory and I go, I'm just using your own logic, but I'm telling you, I'm not gonna soft wash or sugarcoat what is really happening in America, even if you will. Right? Because I'm sure we all have people in our life where we go, you're seeing the same things that I'm seeing, right? You are seeing masked ICE agents rappel down helicopters that we use in the Iraq War and zip tying children who are naked and separating them from their mother.
In Chicago.
Yeah. Like you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing. So if you're seeing it and I'm seeing it and your response is, well, maybe they kind of deserved it, or hey, I don't know the context, then we are just miles apart in the business of truth-telling.
Let me say something about that real quickly.
Please.
This is important to recognize. When I talk about human, as I was just doing, the power of color to signify what color, when we talk about human difference, does for us. If you know what semiotics are, study of semiotics, how, chair is just a symbol that has meaning that we pack onto it. It's so that when I say chair, you picture something, but a rock can be a chair. A table can be a chair. It's the meaning of that when the word is mentioned. And bodies are indexed as though they're semiotic things by color, so that the body speaks. People speak before any language, any words are uttered. We have an interpretation of morality, of intelligence, of so forth, beauty, indexed on bodies, spoken before any words said. When Kirk says, "If I see a black, pilot,"
yeah.
his body is speaking something about capability, about ability, and so forth. The challenge for us is to engage in how that is at work in our minds. We are formed in a world that does that to us and for us. So that, and the reason why I'm saying this is because some bodies are always within the moral scope of our responsibility. That happens to some bodies. It rises to the level of moral concern much more so than it does if it happens to those bodies. Those bodies somehow intrinsically identified with criminality, with immorality, with ugly. It's not as concerning for us than if those bodies were indexed with different kind of meaning for us, morality and so forth and such. That they are within our moral scope of responsibility, not out of bounds. That's how that would work.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's so important, I think, especially in and I say this as someone who is a 6'4" white, bro-evangelical passing man. I say this as someone who's that, there's a certain responsibility, I think, for folks who are formed in this world to really do all the work that we can, that deep work of realizing that first off, we are always going to be in a state of becoming and also rooting out our own racism that we've inherited and our own, insert thing. It's not well, I was this, now I'm all pure again. There's a process of realizing, oh, where did that come from? Where did that thought come from? Why am I not seeing what some of my neighbors who I trust, who don't look like me, are seeing, right? So there's that, and there's also, and this is my personal argument, but there's also, I would argue, a deep responsibility for folks like us, right, to be the ones who are taking a lot of the arrows that Christian fascists are aiming at our most marginalized neighbors. That I don't mean white savior shit. That's not what I'm saying, right? We have to be led by and be led by the voice of those underneath the boot of empire. They have to shape how we understand it. But I think that there's a moral obligation for folks like myself who walk through America built for a place like me, right? This is why I can go to America Fest and I'm not worried about my own safety, because I can speak the language and I can shake their hand and I look a certain way. And I guess maybe the term is kind of code switch a little bit, between the evangelical inside jokes and then what I'm doing now, right? But that allows me a certain privilege where I know those people, they talk to me, I have their phone numbers. When Charlie was killed, I texted a few of them. Hey, I saw what happened. Obviously, I condemn it. I'm really sorry. But I do that because then I can be on the inside understanding how this world works. And my contribution is the education of hey, this shit's really bad. But that's a different story than what Reverend Otis Moss is doing or Jamar Tisby is doing, right? So I just think it's really important what you just said, because the question is, and again, I'm just speaking from my own experience, one of the things I had a problem with at the beginning, I'm deconstructing. I'm like, oh, my white privilege, what do I do? I was born this way. And one of my good friends, who's a black woman, goes to me, she goes, just use your privilege for good, white boy. And I'm like, okay, I think I can do that. I can't control what I look like or how I move through the world, but I can control what I do with it. And I think that's just really important for how we navigate a very serious reality of, Christian fascism is not a threat, it's a reality, right? We're all seeing the same stuff. Our tax dollars are funding genocide in Gaza still, no matter what Trump says about peace, and we're seeing what's happening in Chicago. What is the call of folks like us to use things that we can't control, right, for the sake of the other, and to be in solidarity with them? That's what I think about.
Yeah, let me just pause for just one moment. You mentioned Gaza. In August, I had the privilege of spending some time in the West Bank. Now, prior to that, I'd been to West Jerusalem twice, studying at a rabbinic school called Shalom Hartman, as a part of a cohort of scholars, Christian scholars, and pastors who would go over occasionally, and we would train over there. I was the last cohort. They got sick and tired of us after my cohort. And I say that kind of jokingly, but I really do think we shut the thing down by our push for their attention to racial matters. But When we would talk to Palestinians, we were always met with the other side of this as well, hearing both sides of this. This was the argument. But in August, I went as a part of a program in East Jerusalem, and they weren't trying to do propaganda, which is what I would say I heard a lot of in the first trip. This one was just representation, just walking through spaces. Palestinian spaces. And there was one story, I have a hard time telling this story oftentimes without getting choked up, because this one I wanted to leave immediately. I needed to go home. But we went to the home of a man who is from Florida. And he's got family in a village there that's populated. It's a Christian Palestinian village called Taiba. And they would come over and they would do holiday or summer for a couple of months, because they have property there. This man brought his family and his 3 kids. After they'd been there for a couple of weeks, they got a knock on the door, 3 a.m. The Israeli Defense Forces ask who's in the house. And he's, startled awake, and there's bright lights and armed people at his door, and he names the people in the house. And when he gets to his 15-year-old son, they want to see him. He marches back into the bedroom where his 15-year-old son is, wakes his son up out of bed, startled, and the IDF asks him questions, and they lead him out of the house, blindfold him, and zip tie him. They have not seen that boy for 8 months. His name is Mohammed Ibrahim. When we sat in front of his dad to speak, he was a shell of a man, as you might imagine. It had been 6 months at that time since he'd seen his son. He'd only heard about his son, knowing that his son had lost a lot of weight, some 25, 30 pounds, and had scabies. He's in a prison it's a very dangerous prison. Other boys in that same cell area had died. And while little Muhammad had been in there, Israeli settlers had killed his 20-year-old first cousin, in the same village. That's another story too. It's not very long, it's a short one. But while we were there and we heard his story, we were immediately moved to do something. And I Google Mohammed Ibrahim, Palestinian in prison, Palestinian boy in prison, and contact your congressman. Do what we can to continue that story, putting that story in front of politicians. They are aware of it, but it's also important to know that in this recent prisoner exchange, when Hamas released those hostages, that Israel released 2,000 Palestinians, beaten and emaciated, many of them just held in prison without charges at all.
Yeah.
There are still 10,000 at least in prison, many of them kids, and many of them with no charges against them. Little Muhammad was charged with throwing rocks. No exaggeration, you could find it online. He's charged with throwing rocks, and he's in an indefinite hold. So I want to make sure that while I have this space and this time, I wanted to make sure that you know his story. And there is something that the only reason why they can do that, why they can act in that way with children there, is because this government is their big brother.
Yeah. Do you think...
And this whole Christian Zionist narrative is the white nationalist narrative.
Yeah.
It's that. There is direct connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, John Hagee and goes on and on and on, for sure. Yeah, no, So, first off, what time is this really end? Is it 4 o'clock or 4:30? Because it's 4 o'clock now. Perfect. Okay, great. We'll do a few more minutes. Maybe we'll do a few Q&As with some people. So I like hearing from the audience. Oh, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. So, I know that all of us have seen a lot of things on the internet. I think every day we open our feeds and we're just like, whoa, it's a fire hose of just things that we can't control that are just horrific. Whether it is the children that we see coming out of Gaza. I mean, there's so many just stats that are just jaw-droppingly shocking that our government on both sides have been complicit in funding, to be clear. Gaza is the largest home of child amputees anywhere in the world. 92% of Gaza has been destroyed. And by the way, for an analogy, Gaza is about the size of Philadelphia, give or take. So imagine if in about 2 years, 92% of Philadelphia was just gone, just rubble. Right? Like, this has been going on. So we have that going on. We're seeing what's happening in Chicago and Portland. All these things are happening. And I think that there's a whole conversation to have around social media and if our brains can even handle this much information. We'll put that aside. I'm curious, in the Black liberation context or like in the theology and framework ethically, what is the response to this? Because I'll be completely honest with you, Reggie. I've talked to some friends where I'm like, if I see an ICE agent, I think I'm ready to go to prison. I'm at that point where I'm like, I am angry, and I am like, I feel that sense of I'm not a violent person at all, ever in my life. It's not a thing. But I'm so ramped up, I'm so enraged by what's happening in the name of the God that I pledged allegiance to as a child, that I'm ready. Put me in, coach. But I know that also I don't think violence is the answer. But there's that lizard part of my brain that's I don't know, maybe it can be, So I'm just kind of curious, given that this is not a bug, this is a feature, we can argue, of the American empire and what it does. How does Black liberation theology answer that question in the face of real violence?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. That's the question. So it's important to recognize when I started my description of Black liberation theology is I said it initially when it hit the classroom, when it hit the academy, it had these traits to it. But Black liberation theology is not as old as that classroom theology. Black liberation theology is one iteration of the Black social gospel, which is Black abolitionist Christianity. So the Black abolitionist Christianity has been in place, in action in this country for centuries. This is the Christianity that says, not everybody talking about heaven is going there. It says, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes and walk around heaven all day. Meaning the segregationist narrative is not the gospel. That it says, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. The song implies that the singer was there. In fact, all of us were there. What role did you play? Were you an accuser? Did you have a hammer and nails? So, or were you also on the cross? And that language, it's just an affirmation of the struggle that we go through in this world, where bodies are on crosses to make sacred white space. So the first thing it does is it recognizes the struggle, where the struggle is being identified with by Christ. That's the first thing. The second thing that one might say it does is it empowers you, it empowers us in what we do see and what we experience. It's not necessarily going to say we should take up arms and kill the oppressors, because if Black Christianity was a violent Christianity, we'd have been just swimming in blood in this country for a long time, swimming in blood. But it is not that. It's just not violent. It is this Christianity that still bears witness to the fact that God is with the marginalized and the oppressed. When Jesus notices the woman who gives her 2 mites, everybody else ignored her. Nobody else saw her. Jesus saw her and highlighted her. That's the language of Black liberation theology. That coming out of her context is a recognition of, is the voice of Christ. So I would point to that first and foremost. What we would do in response to this question it's challenging to say that there is these 5 things to do.
Yeah.
I don't really have a list of things to do. When Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas was making those claims today, I thought those were very helpful. I thought they were tremendously helpful, in fact. But it's difficult to say that is the response, because life is dynamic.
Yeah.
And once you name the response, something changes. You need to know, you recognize where the voice of God is coming from and how recognition of God is happening. And it's not something that we can script. It just isn't something it's just not like that. But you know that it certainly is recognizing that you and I are at risk if you're following Christ in the context of an oppressive government. You are at risk. To not be at risk is to be comfortable in a country where people are harmed. And why would you be comfortable if you're a follower of Christ? Why would you choose that?
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. I told you I wouldn't talk a lot about Bonhoeffer because you talk about him a lot and you did earlier today, but I have one question related to Bonhoeffer kind of today. You made a comment in your session earlier just kind of about how serious this moment is, with like the crux of where we are in American history. I want you to kind of reiterate that for a minute here because, based on your study of Bonhoeffer, his life, his context, again, this goes back to the claim of like, oh, well, these people are just calling us Nazis and neo-Nazis. And it's like, well, for the record, there's a reason why people are comparing, because there's been people who know they have the receipts, so they can kind of see, as Jamar Tisby says, that history doesn't repeat itself, it often rhymes, right? The idea of we hear these echoes. So I am curious for you, just based on your scholarship, on your expertise here, based on what you know about Bonhoeffer, where he's coming from, how dire of a moment are we actually in? Because I think it's hard for people like myself to know always okay, have we been here before in history and gotten through it? Is this really unprecedented in American history? How do you kind of read the moment that we're in?
By having conversation with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In conversation with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it's helpful to recognize the temperature of this water we're in, the climate of this nation right now. And without doing, I hate to be in public space fear mongering. First, let me begin before I get on to fear mongering, to recognize that spaces like this, where there are others of us who can't stand what we're seeing, are helpful. Yeah. We are not alone. Yeah. And we're about to see marches all over the country tomorrow of other people who also hate this moment, and they recognize that we're in the middle of something terrible, which is why Greg Abbott is deploying the National Guard in Texas. Because they recognize too that the numbers against them are greater than the numbers that are for them. So let's start there. After World War I, the country felt like they had lost tremendous amount. Before World War I, Germany was in a great moment. So the August days of German history. It was in the midst of this wonderful folkish movement that started the country in 1871, and it continued until 1945 and the end of World War II, this folkish movement. But in 1914, at the beginning of the war, they were in this folkish movement, which is a kind of a ethnic pride moment that swept them up into a country and so forth. And they went into the war with this attitude of great Germany. 4 years later, they weren't thinking that way anymore. And an armistice was signed while they were on the battlefield to end the war. It led a bunch of soldiers to believe that they had been stabbed in the back because they thought they could have won that war. Some of them did, but there was no way they could have won the war. There was no way. In fact, there were military weapons that were designed by the Allies to keep their colonies in place, that were then used in this great war that gave rise to a whole other kind of warfare, trench warfare, with these really powerful weapons. And they were, Germany had been visited near every household by death. And there was no way that they could have won that war, okay? But afterwards, some of them felt like they had been stabbed in the back. And in 1919, in Munich, Germany, a group of them started meeting and talking about how they'd been stabbed in the back. They were angry at Marxists and Jews and socialists, and so forth. Years later, that same group had a spokesman, a very good spokesperson. The National Socialist, National German Workers' Party, Socialist German, in the NSDAP. I'm forgetting the exact wording for this, but the National Socialist Party, the Nazis is what they were. And they were talking about how they had been stabbed in the back, and they needed to, in order to remedy the problem, they needed to purify Germany of its biological contaminants, including the November criminals. These are the people who signed the armistice. The political opponents first. They targeted their political opponents. They had a single party, I'm skipping over a lot, but they had a single party system. They targeted their political opponents, and then they went after the biological impurities in the country. This administration has no doubt studied that. They have no doubt studied that. You've already heard the language of biological contaminants. You've already heard that. And he makes use of that language in regards to immigrants. But this language of biological contaminants is the Nazi effort to purify the folk of their impurities. It wasn't the blacks or the reds or the browns or so forth that were the problems in Germany. It was the mixing, the race mixing of the pure German by those other races in the country. So this language of biological contaminants was part of the problem. And when Dietrich came on the scene and he's speaking about this, he realizes the problem is for him the problem is Christological. That they don't have a good understanding of the way that Christ is shaping the way we should relate to each other. And he's got this in a different way, an intervening way, a specific way that he's talking about this. Fascinating fact is, Hitler thinks of it as Christological too. That he embodies the nation as a salvific figure for the country, and he alone can bring it back to its August days of pre-war greatness. He alone can save it.
Is that charisma?
That is the charisma.
Charisma.
That is the charismatic figure that he recognized that the country is suffering, or the people are suffering from something that can be remedied within their lifetime by the figure who alone embodies the power to make it happen. Violence is justifiable. Laws don't matter. It's the charisma and the ability to renew the greatness, to bring about the greatness that is all that matters. That will justify violence, justify law breaking, make clear path for him, and garner a sense of emotional loyalty to this figure. I mentioned this morning palingenesis. As a term that's coined by, or actually that's used by this British political scientist, palingenetic ultranationalism, from the words palin meaning beginning and genesis birth, rebirth of the country in this ultranationalist sense. So the Italian fascists were the revival of the Roman Empire. The German fascists were the revival of Germany in a 1,000-year reich. Much the same way in Spanish fascism and in our fascism, making America great again around this charismatic leader, purifying the country of its biological contaminants, pushing strongly for a single-party system. And this Supreme Court just may give it to them when they gut the Voting Rights Act. We are in the midst of something right now that it's been slow-moving, and the ingredients have always been there. When when James Cone is pointing to all of these problems within Christianity, years ago, and people would say, look, why can't you just recognize that we've made some progress here in the country? Right. And they're pointing to these things that are happening all over the place, that are present. My theological training, anybody that was not white was on the recommended reading list, if at all, there. Meaning that the only people who have contributed to the Theological Academy are elite white minds only. These foundational pieces of Christian nationalism that we're facing right now, where the cake is being baked with these ingredients that have been present here for a long time. This is what we're facing.
Yeah. Look, I know that's it's a scary thing to think about, but I also believe that truth-telling, like we've been saying, is really important in that, in a healthy way, the reality check of what we're in can be a very powerful motivator for you to do whatever you can do in your local communities. I definitely think that one of the ways that we resist and that we respond to this is not just at the national level, it's not on the social medias, it's can you run for school board? Are you talking to your local government? Are you talking to your legislators? Are you talking to your mayor about what do we do if ICE shows up? Those things, I think, is the reaction to some of this stuff, and this should be the motivation for it, right? Because we know what's going on, but I think when you have someone, as just as influential and as knowledgeable as Reggie, given his training and his studies, when he's saying this, like, this is a credible thing, this isn't just me behind a microphone all amped up one day, right? This is real. I think it's really important for us to realize that, but I love what you said in the beginning, that you're not alone in the journey. And as someone who is working mostly alone with a camera or a microphone, it can feel lonely. It can feel like, is there anyone else out there seeing this stuff? And the answer to that question, I think the reason why I make a point to come out to Beer Camp every year, it's a reminder that, no, I'm not alone in this stuff. There are people out there who are thinking about this deeply, who know more about this than I ever will, who can shape how I respond to this. So I think that's really important.
And the other, thank you. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think some of the things that we face right now, some of the threats we face immediately are apathy. Yeah. The volume of cruelty on display right now can breed apathy, can cause those moral sensibilities to become dulled. Yeah. Don't let that happen. Yeah. Secondly, it causes a kind of a moral nose blindness too. I guess that's part of apathy. When the country right now is reeking of immorality and cruelty, and we can go morally nose blind. That's why it's important to be around others who recognize the evil that we are seeing right now. Call it out and don't become desensitized to it. Yes. Those are some of the things that we can do, practically that we can do. Because if you stay sensitive to the moral injustices that we're seeing on a regular basis, the opportunity will always arise for us to act, for us to do what we should do as a people of conscience.
Yeah, no, I want to piggyback off that quickly because you're absolutely correct. It is not acceptable that we're zip tying children. It is not acceptable that we're politicizing the military and sending it to cities. And I think one of what you said is so true, where I think so I've been in this work now maybe 4.5, 5 years. I remember when Marjorie Taylor Greene spoke at Nick Fuentes' conference, and it made national headlines. And I was like, I can't believe it. Like, this person is a white nationalist who says the Holocaust was maybe not as serious as we all were led to believe. And a sitting politician is doing that. And then Trump got dinner with him I'm not sure if you all know that, but Trump got dinner with Nick Fuentes. And now Nick is kind of in the mainstream in a lot of ways because he's just been normalized. Oh, this is just what the right wing is now. That is one of the most dangerous things that we can allow to happen, is to accept it as, well, I guess back then it was radical, but now it's just kind of what it is. No, it's not acceptable, right? We have to be able to always call out, it's not acceptable that we have leaked text messages of young, air quotes, conservatives using, saying things like Hitler was great and using racial slurs and other things. And then our sitting vice president says, well, we don't want to ruin someone's career over that. We're just kidding. That's not acceptable, period, right? And so I also want to just encourage you to, and this might be tricky for some of you because you only have family members that see things differently. But the least you can do if you are on social media at all, the least you can do is to be very loud about how damn unacceptable it is that we are living in a society where white Christians who want to own the corner on biblical truth and true Christianity are calling J.D. Vance a great Christian man and backing him on the claim that we shouldn't cancel someone over Hitler was great remarks. That's I just want to emphasize how low the bar is for us at this point. And if you can't say that on social media because you're afraid of what your mom or dad or your sibling might say, you might want to rethink if you're really in this or not. Because that's bare bones. So I just want to really, hopefully light a fire underneath of you all that you have to speak out. You have to. Silence is not an option at this point. We cannot normalize things that they want normalized. Because as you said, we can look at other regimes throughout history and see where it leads. And while we're not all the way there yet, we are well along the path where if we don't stop it now, it will only get more violent. It will only get more deadly. One last thing I'll give back to you. Don't forget, we built a concentration camp in Florida, right? It's funny how people are we don't have money to pay for affordable health care. Well, we can find $400 million overnight for a facility that costs $100,000 per inmate to house. That's no big deal, apparently. They build this, and all of a sudden the courts are hey, you gotta stop doing that. And now this administration, this regime, has lost over 1,000 immigrants. We don't know where they are. We don't know where they are. They just disappeared. The regime has them, but we don't know where they are. And again, we think about that. Imagine you're back in Germany and you hear that news story. We would say now, oh, well, we know what happened back then, but now we're well, we don't really know. They're probably fine, probably being well fed. We don't know. That kind of stuff must prick our moral conscience every day to be loud about what is happening in this country. Because once we give over to propaganda, we normalize what should never be normal, especially as people claiming allegiance to the radical way of Jesus, right? This is the radical part that I was taught as a kid, right? Would you die for your faith? I'm well, that's actually a pretty radical question, and I'm asking that question now in a whole different context, right? But I would argue that the word faith is better translated allegiance. It's not about just this mental ascension, do I believe? Do you have radical allegiance to carry your own cross for the sake of the other? Do you have radical allegiance to be pricked by oppression in solidarity with the oppressed? Do you have radical allegiance to the non-violent way of Jesus, no matter what it costs you? And these are questions you have to answer yourself that I'm wrestling with as well. But this is where we have to head, I think, in this cultural moment.
Yeah, I see that we're coming close to time, but I want to tell you about a book I'm writing. I think would be a helpful way to conclude here. The working title of the book is riffing off of a song that Aretha Franklin sang at a missionary Baptist church in Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, just at the end of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement had just ended. So the Civil Rights Movement ends in '68 with King's murder. People are ripped up. They're in turmoil. They're wondering, what are we going to do? Nixon is working his Southern strategy, and there's this retrenchment. Much of what we see happening in the country, even today, is white response to the Civil Rights Movement still, which is, in the Civil Rights Movement, is black people pushing forward the efforts to create black inclusion in this country since the Civil War. And this is still a rebuttal to that. So in 1972, Aretha Franklin does this gospel concert. It is still today the most sold gospel album of all time. She opens up the concert by covering this song by Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye had he had this song on an album called What's Going On. The song is called Holy, Holy. WHOLY. HOLY. Holy, Holy. In the aftermath of the end of the civil rights movement, when the country and people who are hungry for justice are devastated, she begins by singing Holy, Holy. And the song has several different meanings. The title has several meanings. One is sacredness in collectivity, not in individual righteousness or morality or so forth, or individualness or individuality or autonomy or so forth. But our sacredness is in our collectivity, first. Secondly, by covering this song, she points to the fact that the intent of the song belongs to the collective hope for something greater. It is all of ours as we want something more and greater. This is a description of us. Third, it also indicates that these people singing the song, including those who may be described in profane ways, are in fact sacred before God. It is a whole nother wellspring of thinking of hope, joy, and God's activity in this moment that she begins the concert with. Holy, Holy. And that's what the book is titled, Holy, Holy, and Ethics After Whiteness. I hope that would at least thinking of this is a repository for imagining what the gospel should be about and what we are to be about doing as believers in this moment right now, that this is a funding source for thinking about participating with God and what God is doing in the world right now, where we're at. Holy, Holy. What's that?
Yeah,
well, I got to turn the manuscript in June 26th.
Okay.
On June 26th, yeah.
Time.
I also have another one on Bonhoeffer, but that's...
Well, we'll get you back on the podcast when that book's about to come out.
When that one, yeah, I'll do that. All right, good.
So, Reggie, thank you so much for joining. Sure. It was really great to have you. Do you think, Reggie? Amazing. Okay. Yeah, fantastic. Truly. So good, man. I have a few quick announcements, and then we'll wrap this up. I was texted by someone in charge of Beer Camp that said, I'm going to just read it. The third food truck canceled because their generator died, so we have 2 food trucks. Please remind people to be patient when you're eating, so don't forget that. Really quick, 2 things. Someone asked me a question, I want to answer it, because this is a good point. What is a new evangelical? What are the characteristics? Really quick, the New Evangelicals is really a nonprofit organization that I started by accident, and that's a true story. We are committed to fighting Christian nationalism and helping people find a better path forward in their faith. We are a digital-first nonprofit. You can go to thenewevangelicals.com and see all of our resources. We have a private community that's totally free to join off of the Meta algorithm. It's its own app. It's quiet there. We have things like Theology 101. Dr. James McGrath, who's here, has led a class before. Everything we offer is totally free. So you can find more there or follow us on Instagram or podcasts, etc. Last thing I want to say briefly is just a personal thank you. I'm not sure how many of you listen to the podcast or listen to the content that I get the privilege to make, but seriously, it's a huge honor to do this work, and I never get to see people who listen to the podcast, so this is always so nice. I just want to personally thank all of you for listening and allowing me to do what I get the privilege to do with Rebecca, our board president, Melinda Hale, our executive director. We love the work, and we are committed to doing all we can as a very small nonprofit to help you feel not alone in your journey. Because as someone who lost my faith community when I had these moments and started speaking out about them, I know how painful it is to lose that sense of belonging. I know how painful it is to lose the friendships that you thought you were going to do life together with your whole life and your family. And then you start asking, I don't know, maybe like we're on the wrong side of Black Lives Matter. I don't know, maybe our queer neighbors can be included. And all of a sudden you're seen as the heretic. I say that out of personal, painful experiences. I know what that's like. And I also know what it's like to look around and feel like I'm going mad that my friends and neighbors and my Sunday school teachers who taught me songs like, Jesus loves the little children of the world, I'm trying to argue with on Facebook that maybe we shouldn't be bombing them in Gaza, right? I just want to say I understand that. And it is truly, and I mean this sincerely, you can ask my wife who's here. I'm not sure if she's here, if she went away because she hears me rant all day. But it is truly the honor of my life to do this work. I do not take it for granted, and I appreciate all of you listening. So thank you. That's it.